welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to the designer, author, and speaker Manuel Lima. Manuel is one of those people whose work and books I had seen around for years, but never really put together that they were all coming from the same person until a few months ago, actually, when I interviewed Ellen Lupton back over the summer. As you know, at the end of every interview, I always ask the guests for some books or author recommendations, and Ellen said how much she liked the work of Manuel Lima. Then, a couple days later, Rob Gianpietro, who was my very first podcast guest, messaged me after listening to that episode saying that he actually works with Manuel at Google. So, a few weeks after that, I found myself at Google's New York office recording this conversation. Manuel is probably best known for his website Visual Complexity, which is a blog that cataloged examples of information graphics and data visualizations, as well as his books, the Book of Trees and the Book of Circles. But he's also a design lead at Google and lectures and writes frequently about data visualization. In our conversation, Manuel and I talk about these two strands of his career and really how he thinks about the split between writing and researching and speaking versus the designing and managing and being a practitioner. In a lot of ways, Manuel is the sort of quintessential Scratching the Surface guest. He works across disciplines and seems to move seamlessly between practicing and scholarship. And I just really loved talking to him and really enjoyed this conversation and hearing about how he thinks about his work and how he's developed this really unique practice. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Manuel Lima. I kind of wanted to start just before we kind of talk about these larger ideas that I'm interested in with just a little bit of your background. I was able to kind of read some of it online, but it seemed like you had this very kind of interesting and diverse background that I'd like to talk about a little bit first. So I guess that's a kind of good way to start, is just kind of where your interest in design came from or how you got started working in design.
It's a great question. I think maybe I was 16 and I was in Portugal in high school, and I had a great class. It was actually on industrial design.
Okay.
And that was really the first time that I was exposed to this, because I always thought sort of the only possible path, if anyone interested in art, is architecture. It's only like money-making possibility, right? And then once I had that class, it kind of opened my eyes to a new sort of realm, right? A realm where you might feel like an empowered artist, but you can also make money in the process and create beautiful things that are functional and have an immediate use on someone else's lives. Mm-hmm. I think that was really compelling to me. Right? And that's why I ended up studying as an undergraduate student, industrial design. In Lisbon.
And what were you thinking you wanted to design at that point? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like were you thinking of furniture or products?
I don't think I had a specific object in mind. I always thought cutlery was really an interesting sort of like object. I mean, I remember even like my dad once brought me one of those cutlery utensils that you had in some planes back in the day, that a fork, well, the same object was both a fork, a spoon, and a knife. Yeah. And I thought that was like such a creative sort of take on something that we use on a regular basis. So that was really intriguing to me, but I never had like objects that was like really fetishized about.
Well, I love that cutlery was the thing also, because a lot of times industrial designers, or at least the industrial designers I know, have these kind of grand ambitions. Like, I want to redesign the chair, or I want to, technology. I want to do the new laptop or something. Sure. And then you have something that was just so utilitarian that you were so fascinated by.
I think it was more about the utilitarian aspect of design more than the aesthetics per se. That was always like more of a strong sort of interest of mine. Like, how can you sort of revamp something and rethink something that you use on a regular basis, but in a completely different way that can be much better for people and enhance their lives in some way.
This makes a lot of sense to me, because I was kind of thinking about on the subway here, I was thinking about kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, and I last year taught 2 user experience and kind of user interface design classes to undergrad students, and was thinking about how much overlap there is in talking about industrial design or kind of product design in kind of the traditional sense, not digital product design, with ideas of user experience, and that there's a lot you can kind of pull from the two, especially in regards to function and utilitarianism and things like that. And so, where did that bridge? How did you cross that bridge between kind of thinking about these physical products to now having a career that's mostly been online, right?
Yeah, I think that was in college, and in college, I mean, the great thing about my undergrad was just the diversity of things I ended up designing. You know, from phones to chairs to step ladders. I mean, you name it. And ceramics. We really played with every set of medium and material and object, and that alone was immensely empowering. But then, as I get older, I think so. Those degrees in Europe, in most places in Europe, are actually 5 to 6 years.
Oh, okay.
So it's a pretty intense undergrad course. And I think close to my 4th year, which was almost halfway through the course still, I realized that the industry in Portugal was very slender, to say the best, right? There was not a lot of opportunities for you to be an industrial designer, at least one that would be making a good living. So in many ways, it was kind of like the struggle of an artist, even as an industrial designer in Portugal. And of course, you had other countries in Europe, like Denmark and Italy, that have a much bigger tradition in industrial design. And actually, I ended up doing an internship, an academic internship in Denmark, because I wanted to experience that. But then I think halfway through, I realized that the digital was also very appealing. This was also, at the time where web design was a very new thing, where Flash was coming in. So you had this massive sort of potential to design in a whole new medium. And that was immensely compelling, of course, for me. And at the time that I was already experimenting with so many mediums and different materials and so on. And then I took a few courses. I think back in the day it was things like 3D Max, this application that you can create 3D objects, Flash, Director back in the day, designing CD-ROMs. But all of that was, again, it was all about experimenting with things. And I quickly sort of felt that the digital was really appealing. It was more ephemeral, yet you could have more control over it, right? You could change it, you could tweak it all the time. And in the industrial design, that's really hard. Right? There's that sense of you do it and then it just takes too many years.
Were there things from that kind of traditional industrial design education that you found have influenced how you think about working kind of digitally?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of, maybe it's not so much of a coincidence, but now I'm recruiting and hiring UX designers, and a lot of the people that I ended up hiring for my teams, in other places that I've been, such as Microsoft, and Nokia, and now Google, they normally come, from either industrial design, or traditional product design, or architecture. And I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. I think the thinking is very similar, right? I mean, there's a thinking about focusing on the user first, right? I mean, before even you start thinking about the sort of the look and feel of a chair, how it's going to look, you have to think about, is this the right material? You have to think about the environment. You have to think about the ergonomics. All those things are critical from any type of product that you are creating from a user experience point of view.
That's interesting. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but I would not have realized that number was so high.
It is really high. I mean, and this is something that I've been sort of dealing with in my entire career, seeing that sort of overlap. There's a big overlap of people, traditionally from product, industrial design,
that's
navigating
really
into UX. I mean, of course, also because UX, there's a much more sort of market currently for that type of role.
I want to come back to this in a bit, but I want to make sure that we kind of stay on this path for a little bit. I'm curious kind of where your interest, so much of your work, your public work at least, is around kind of data visualization and kind of information graphics and things like that. How did that start to kind of filter into this?
Yeah, that happened during my master's, my
Okay.
MFA at Parsons,
Okay.
right? So I was telling you I did an internship in Denmark,
Right.
and that was immensely compelling for me. I really wanted to experiment again, continue that experimentation of different mediums and materials.
Right.
So I chose, I didn't choose necessarily, I sent a bunch of resumes to a bunch of companies in Denmark. It had to be in Denmark because I'd been there a few years before. I was maybe 15 or something. And I was just amazed by how design is such an important aspect of their culture, right? It's one of those countries where you go into a taxi and you say you're a designer and they look at you as if you're a god, right? Yeah. So that sense of like, wow, they really respect, they value design to a level I've never experienced before, right? And in a certain degree, you can expand that to all of Scandinavia. But Denmark was really compelling to me. And so I sent a bunch of resumes to different companies there, and then one of them accepted, said, yes, please come in, we would love to have you. That was Contrapunct.
Okay.
I don't know if they're even still around, but at the time, one of the great things about that company was that they were doing both industrial design, web design, they were doing traditional graphic design and printing. They were doing all the CD-ROM new stuff. So they were really experimenting with a bunch of different things. And for me to be exposed to that, right in a professional setting, was, again, really enriching.
Okay.
And then it was during that internship that I met someone who had been at Parsons.
Okay.
And that person recommended me that program.
Okay.
And then I went back to Portugal, worked on my portfolio, applied to Parsons, was able to get in. And then it was really kind of changed my career.
And so, I'm kind of struggling to ask this question. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to ask, but you kind of discovering Parsons and building that portfolio to go there, again, did you kind of know kind of what you were interested in designing at that time? Or did you kind of see this kind of shift happening? Or
not at all. I was still very much in that sort of experimentation phase, which I think every kind of young designer needs to go through, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's kind of a cliche. People say, like, I need to find myself. But it's not necessarily finding yourself, but finding your interests, right?
Okay.
And sometimes you just have to start somewhere. Because if you it's not going to come out of nothing.
Right.
You have to start somewhere, and sometimes it's not even the first thing that you find, but it's like a chain of events that leads to finally the thing that you've been sort of like searching for.
Right.
And for me, that was very much the case. Like, when I was doing my internship in Denmark, I had no idea of data visualization at the time. I don't think I've ever even heard of the term.
Right.
And then I went to Parsons, and then I was, again, still investigating from 3D to physical computing to a bunch of different things, which you should do in grad school, right?
Yeah.
Try different sort of approaches and disciplines. And then there was a teacher of mine. He was teaching this class called Information Architecture.
Okay.
And I remember him showing this diagram, which is called the understanding spectrum.
Okay.
Where data leads into information, information leads into knowledge.
Right. I know this. Yeah.
And knowledge leads into wisdom. So it's called this understanding spectrum. And again, even though my background was, of course, in industrial design, I was just so compelled to be part of the process, especially creating the bridge between information and knowledge, right? Between producers and consumers.
Right.
Like, how can we make that an effective bridge, an effective link? That was really compelling.
And I mean, and that, it sounds like that really changed kind of the entire trajectory of your career going forward.
Absolutely. It kind of did, yeah.
And so I'm very curious kind of where the kind of research and the writing, and that you're a practicing designer, but then you're also kind of producing these books that are kind of about history and culture and like the ideas behind data visualization and information graphics. Where did that interest come in that you didn't just want to be making these, but you wanted to be kind of teaching them and studying them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Looking back, I think that was really like the fork in the road, right?
Yeah.
And the branch and the forking happened in such a way that when I graduated from Parsons, my MFA in design and technology, then I had to get a job, right?
Right.
That was priority number one.
Yeah.
I need to get some money to pay the rent, and then I went to RGA, Right?
Okay.
And even though I was a young sort of UX designer, and again, I was actually an interaction designer, I should say.
Okay. Right.
Which is, was still a very sort of new practice, even for RGA. And RGA,
Yeah.
in many ways, I think have really been a critical sort of element in the industry, not dictating, but like really exemplifying what interaction design is as a practice.
Right.
And for me, it was a remarkable school to be, what makes a great interaction designer. So that was really compelling. So I started a job there in RGA. I was really excited. But then even to be honest, because the last year during my MFA was so intense, I had never like a break. I never had a break. I was working like, all during the week, weekends and so on. I found that having all of a sudden like 2 days that I don't have to work was really strange, right? Right. So I found myself with all this empty time, right? I had nothing else to do. And I thought to myself, I knew that I was immensely passionate about data visualization, about going back to that diagram. Even my thesis was already about data visualization, was this project called BlogViz, trying to understand how information spreads across the blogosphere. And that thing was not completely dormant. It was very active in my brain, in my sort of being. And I wanted to do something with it. And then by having all this free time, all the weekends, I started putting together visualcomplexity.com, which was in many ways the result of my 1 to 2 years research for my thesis, right? All the projects that I uncovered, mapping networks in a different way.
And so the visual complexity site was not part of your thesis,
or was not part
of my thesis. It was kind of after you graduated.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So I started. So again, like after that sort of class, information architecture, with this great teacher of mine, I started doing. Everything else became related with data visualization. All the projects that I got involved, all the classes that I chose moving forward, were all related to that discipline in one way or the other. So I did things like visualizing human viruses and computer viruses to see if there's any sort of overlap or similarities in the way that they spread. I started mapping how diseases spread in the US. And then I went to my thesis, and I was really interested in this idea of information diffusion, this idea of word of mouth, how certain memes, or ideas, or bits of information get spread from person A to person B. And as you can imagine, this has been a great interest for social sciences, How, again, information spreads within a social setting. But over time, it has been extremely hard to actually track that, the spread, the flow of information. But then, of course, came the web, came the blogosphere, and it became a lot easier for us to understand the sort of the spread of information within that particular setting. And that was really I was really passionate about that, I wanted to sort of explore, and so my thesis was really about, again, mapping the information diffusion within blog space, within the blogosphere. How one specific meme, starts by a blog posting something, and then how it spreads, how it contaminates other bloggers and blogs, and how it all of a sudden spreads to the mainstream. So that sort of process was really compelling to me at the time. But then in order for me to start visualizing all of this, I had to start seeing what other people were mapping and visualizing. So that's how my research was primarily about compiling all these examples of network visualizations, And I was really trying to be as pluralistic as possible, picking examples from biology, from computer systems, from social networks, etc. So, but then that research was done. Once I finished, I graduated, I found a job at RGA. Like all that research was again dormant in my laptop. So I started working on visualcomplexity.com as a way to, first and foremost, to actually organize my own personal research, to make it useful for myself, as a bookmarking system in a way. But also, I felt that maybe some people will find this useful.
This is exactly, as you were talking about this is what I was thinking about, is where that idea that what essentially was your personal research could be something that was public or shared. And kind of what was the value that you saw in that, or why was that something that was interesting to you?
You never know exactly. I mean, just because you have an interest in something, you never know exactly if even one more person will find that equally compelling or equally interesting. So it's always a risk. But I don't think I was even in sort of that. I was not even thinking about either making money of it or just like getting a larger audience. I was really just, well, first of all, I had all this free time, right?
Right.
So I wanted to like make something useful with that free time. And for me, it was, again, primarily useful for me, right?
Yeah.
It was really about creating my own personal bookmarking system, organizing my research and putting all the things together, because you never know when you're going to need it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I was working on a project at RGA that I wanted to go back and find, be inspired by some of that. But I think maybe in the back of my mind was the thinking that, maybe I think other people will find this relevant.
And I guess
there could be something there.
And I guess there was this almost, you'd spent these last 2 years or whatever, kind of working on your thesis, thinking about organizing information, that in all of this information that you had researched for that project, that then became a project of itself to organize all of that information in a way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I think, well, maybe that's maybe you are uncovering something, because I mean, in my books, I'm somehow an example of that. I'm slightly obsessed with taxonomical processes, right? Making sense of the world and organizing things and putting those things into categories and all that. I even had I think an old manager of mine at Microsoft even compared me to, at some point, to an 18th century biologist, like looks at the world and like categorizes everything and creates this like system for making sense of the world. So I was really compelled by that, right? And maybe that was sort of the whole sort of genesis of visual complexity.
I mean, it almost reminds me of, and this is a little bit off topic, but it's I talked to Michael Rock for this podcast, and he has this kind of idea that he and I talked about when I interviewed him, and he's kind of talked about it in other places, that design at its kind of very core fundamental level is about creating coherences, and it's about putting kind of frames around things, or it's a system of organizing things to make the world understandable. And so that's everything from city blocks to country borders could all be seen as design gestures. And so when your manager kind of compares you to a biologist, it's the same thing. It's kind of like that's in a lot of ways what designers are doing in a kind of wider sense, I think.
I mean, I think it's really like the way we, I mean, even putting design apart, I think it's the way we humans understand the world around us, right? We are a classifying animal. We only understand things in comparison to others, right? So the idea of grouping and categories and all of those taxonomical sort of like processes are critical. And maybe that's how maybe it's a personal way for me to actually make sense of the world.
Right.
I think it's way more general than that. I think it's, again, like how humans actually make sense of the world.
Yeah, I agree. How I'm curious kind of how the website then became books, and that you're kind of giving talks and lecturing on these things. Like, how did that become all of these other things?
Yeah, so again, going back to the forking, right? So, my career as an interaction designer continued, right? Like, and then, I became a senior interaction designer at RGA. And then after RGA in New York, I moved to RGA London to actually, I was actually part of the team of 5 people that created the RGA London.
Oh, wow.
The first office for RGA outside of New York, actually, outside of the US, for sure. It was our first, it was actually second office. Well, it was our second office, right? So being part of that process was fascinating. I think now the London office is huge. I think it's their second biggest or something. But then my career continued, right? Then after RGA, Nokia, Microsoft, etc. But then on the other side, I had sort of like 2 separate lives, right? Which I think it was also like an interesting aspect of it. And then on my data visualization live, let's put it that way. Then I started putting the visual complexity overcome. The website went live, I think, on October 2005.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that was that.
Yeah, 12
that
years
long ago. Yeah,
12 years ago. It was 2 years ago. I was actually celebrating the 10th anniversary, and that's actually when I stopped updating the website. So it's still the website is still up and running.
Right.
And I will, keep it alive for as long as it takes. But updating it's not happening because it's just too demanding. I think you always get to a stage as a blogger. where you either make that your living, right? You become so popular that you actually are able to make a good amount of money out of that, or then it's really hard to find the motivation to keep it going, right? As a side note, as a side project.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
So I think visual complexity, again, it's still there. And then, again, going back to October 2005, I launched the website. I think there was maybe like 200 projects listed when it was live for the first time. Then it went up to 1,000, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, people started, becoming interested in the website. People coming in, people coming out, and then I think the first invites for a conference was, if I recall correctly, was Mesh Forum. I don't even know if the conference is still going in San Francisco.
Okay.
And then that's when the first time I felt, well, I mean, people are reading this, are interested in the topic.
And they wanted you to talk about data visualization?
And they wanted to talk about network visualization specifically.
Okay.
Because the visual complexity was always very sort of focused on the way people have been visualizing networks.
Right. And this is a thing you're doing on the weekends. You still have a full-time job as an interaction designer.
Absolutely. Okay. Weekends and whenever I have some free time, then I did like a form on the website for people to suggest and submit their own projects. So I was like finding ways, but for me that was the most compelling part. Just doing the research, finding all these great projects, categorizing them in interesting ways, finding sort of ways to compare them, writing blog posts about similarities and differences between some of these projects, and as it is, once you get into the sort of the rhythm of conferences and you go to a few, then you start getting invites for others, and all of a sudden my agenda was kind of like packed with conferences throughout a year. I forgot my peak of conferences, what it was, but it was maybe 2008 or 2010. I was attending more than 20 conferences a year.
Oh wow!
It got really intense at some point.
Speaking at all of them, or just
speaking
at
speaking at most of them. Yeah.
This leads into I have a series of questions kind of around just kind of these ideas. Because something that's very interesting to me, and I think it's kind of very related to kind of what the thesis of this podcast is kind of this relationship between theory and practice, or kind of the more kind of academic pursuits around design and being a practicing designer. And that's something that's very interesting to me about you and your kind of career is that, and we've kind of been talking around it, is that there are these two tracks that are really happening parallel, where you're doing visual complexity and now you're speaking at conferences and writing books about these things, but you seem to have never left also being a full-time designer. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in kind of the relationship between those tracks for you. Do they influence each other at all? Do you see them as two separate tracks, or are they kind of all part of one kind of professional creative life? Like, how do you kind of break those down?
It's a great question. I mean, and that's something that I've done a lot of introspection in the last years, just thinking, should I try at some point to sort of merge them back, right?
Yeah.
Get rid of the fork and, have one single sort of like path. But I always felt it's almost like, eating something that you love every day, right? It's almost like having lobster every day, you get tired of it. So that was one aspect for me. Well, I can maybe deconstruct your question in a few ways. Yeah. One of them was this, right? The notion that I always saw data viz as something that I love so much. I don't want to sort of, mess with it. I don't want to sort of I don't want that to become a job. Right?
Okay.
Even though that sounds sort of like weird. But I wanted to keep them separate. Also because maybe that was this concern of if I did data viz, I would get tired of it. Only data viz, I would get tired of it. So that was that aspect. Then I think there was the other sort of component to it was really, I always, even though I love taxonomies and I love systems, thinking in systems and grouping and labels, all that kind of stuff, I hate giving myself labels or giving even others labels in the sense that I would always hate to be inside one single bucket, right? I like thinking to myself as a pluralist and someone that has like multiple interests, right? And I think that plurality has always been much more enriching than if I was only in a bucket. Right?
Yeah.
So even as a teacher, because I used to teach quite different classes at Parsons,
right,
both undergraduate and graduate classes, I learned so much more from the fact that I had a job outside, right, in the industry.
Yeah,
right? And then I could bring some of those sort of values into my class, into my students, and vice versa, right? I could bring like great critiques, great critics for many of the reviews we had in school, but also the other way around. So there was a lot of really interesting sort of polarization of ideas, right? A lot of mix of sort of concepts that you can bring from both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
And I think that was always the kind of situation I wanted to create to myself. One that I could cross-pollinate both.
And they're very separate, but are still very much influencing each other.
Yes, and so sometimes you see the two sides are definitely approaching. Sometimes they might even overlap, either by a project that I'm working on, or even now I'm at Google leading a team that's very much involved in data visualization, right? So there have been times where the overlap has been sort of like quite strong, but they are still separate, right? And also the other aspect, maybe the third aspect, is that I always find academics in general in academia to be too much of an echo chamber, right?
Right.
And even my desire to make visual complexity in the first place was kind of breaking the chain of research that's never seen by anyone outside of academia, right? So putting a lot of that research that would normally be in a paper somewhere in a dusty cabinet and opening it up to the general public. That was also like a really compelling reason for me to do that in the first place.
Yeah.
So that openness of academia to the outside world and bringing the outside world also into academia was also always a strong desire for me.
We're completely speaking the same language here. I think that was kind of my, that's kind of like, in a lot of ways, that's why this project ended up becoming a podcast instead of like a book or something, because I wanted it to not just be an academic text about how design theory affects practice or how criticism affects practice, but could actually be something that was practical and was kind of hitting designers who were actually working, and not just people who already were theorists or academics or something like that.
Yeah, because I think that's a huge sort of concern of mine. It's always like trying to open academia as much as possible.
And you touched on, I have two other questions that kind of came up in your answer that I want to just touch on quickly. And one was, I was interested in that overlap of how much of your work as a practicing designer was revolved around data visualization, because as an outsider looking at your career, it doesn't seem like much. Whether it's kind of Microsoft or even, I don't know much about what you do here, but even at like Code Academy or something, it seems very much about user experience, kind of interface design, kind of that kind of thing, which obviously has some kind of data visualization components, but seems different. You know what I mean?
That was also something else that I've been thinking over the years, like, should I actually be doing? I did some of that in the early times, like when I was doing my master's. I actually was a doer in the domain of data visualization. But then, first of all, at some point, there was a lot of people doing it. So it's always like, there's this field is like being overly populated with doers, right?
Yeah.
And data visualization for me always felt more interesting as a phenomenon, right? Understanding sort of like the growing of a practice, like what's morphing, what's different from the old days, like so this is, again, looking at networks as a cultural metaphor, more than actually being involved in creating metaphors. Like that level of thinking and analysis was always more compelling for me somehow. And that's maybe where we go back to my interest for academia and research, right? Traditionally. So, and that's still to this day something that I love. Even when I put together any of my books, the most compelling aspect for me is the research part of it, right? Like delving into this, like thinking how it has evolved, and reading and expanding thought in that domain.
That's interesting. The other thing that you touched on that I thought was interesting was not wanting your work to only be seen by academics.
Mm.
And a subject that's very interesting to me and that I like talking to people about is this idea of audience
Mm.
and kind of who the writing is for, and especially kind of in my area of design criticism or design theory, so much of it is for other designers or kind of for the profession. But I also have talked to a lot of people who are very interested in writing about design in a way that's accessible to non-designers to kind of better understand how design is, shaping their lives or
Yeah.
something like that. And I'm interested in kind of who both kind of who your imagined audience is when you're putting together a book,
Mm-hmm.
or even giving a talk, but also then kind of who are the people that you kind of hear from. What is the actual audience?
Yeah.
Who are the people that are kind of responding to you?
So one of the great things that I love about, well, actually, I think you can expand that to the three of my books, and even Visual Complexity, is that my audience is immensely diverse, right? It's not a niche. I mean, it might be a niche audience in size, right? It's a small
Yeah.
audience, let's put it that way, but it's not like specific in just one single domain, and
Yeah.
that is something that I love. I normally say that I'm a designer that has no interest whatsoever in design books, in pure design books.
Yeah.
Also because, again, like I don't want to be stuck in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
I don't want to be stuck in just one single sort of point of view.
Right.
And I think I bring that into my books, and you can see that just by the emails that I get from Visual Complexity that I've received over the years, right? So
Yeah.
I get an email from biologists to physicists to artists to architects to designers, from designers, you name it. I mean, I've had architects that have been influenced by some of the projects there.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have a lot of physicists being inspired by the thinking there, and sort of mathematicians are influenced. I mean, it's a plethora of sort of audience.
Yeah.
Because also the diversity that you find in Visual Complexity is, even though all of them are network diagrams and network visualizations, they are touching the most sort of disparate array of topics that you can imagine, right? From, again, from biology, computer systems, and so on.
I mean, I almost want to use that to kind of step back for a second, because I think that raises a really interesting question, and especially thinking that you started the site 12 years ago, that how much kind of the interest in data visualization, information graphics systems has changed in those 12 years, and how popular data visualizations are just in culture now, that's just like a way that people communicate, and that there are like journalists, there's like data journalists now, and things like that. How does that change, kind of culturally changed how you think about that, or are there other changes that you're kind of seeing? That's kind of two separate questions, but
in data visualization, specifically. I mean, of course, it has changed a lot. When I became interested in the topic, again, going back to my master's at Parsons, this was a very, very, very small sort of niche kind of discipline, right? That was primarily practiced by academia, right? Not only that, but also if you wanted to actually do any project in that domain, you had to be pretty well off, well sort of, really control or have some sort of knowledge in the domain of computer science, right? Have a good understanding of at least a few programming languages to make something that was meaningful. These days, of course, everything has changed. I mean, we have programs that have applications and so on that have opened up this floor for anyone that has a minimal interest in the domain. So there's a lot of openness in the field, right? But at the same time, I think, well, this is something else that I like to say a lot about data visualization, is that even though we might think of it as sort of this new discipline to rising to meet the demands of the 21st century, we have been doing information visualization for centuries, right? And if you have read any of my books, you can see that through the pages just by looking at them. So that aspect of it, I always try to fight against this idea that data visualization or information visualization or depicting information is something that's new, that we have never done before. So that's a bias I want to fight against normally throughout my books. But then, of course, notwithstanding that, I think that the field has changed dramatically, and for the good part. And I think there's a lot more people interested in it, and coming and joining the field and doing amazing work in this discipline.
Yeah. We're starting to get short on time, so I have just a couple quick questions to wrap it up. I have kind of one other kind of big question, and I just have a series of questions that I kind of ask everybody. I'm interested in if the books, the lectures, teaching, that research, has that changed how you think about your work as a designer or as a design manager or in building teams? Has that kind of academic side had a change in your work?
It's a great question, Jared. I don't know. I never thought about that. Well, I think it does, right? I mean, I think everything you do, everything you see, everything you experience ends up influencing your thinking, right? So it's impossible for that not to have happened, right? Or not to continue happening. So I would assume that's the case. It's hard to pinpoint specific examples, but it has for sure. And I think I can give you actually an example. One of the great things that I've learned about uncovering some aspects of the past and how people back in the day were already concerned about graphic design, depicting information in meaningful ways, is this notion of ars memorativa, the art of memory.
Oh, yeah.
And this was really the genesis of information design as we know it today. And they created a set of principles to guide designers on how to do proper information design.
Right.
Because it was more memorable, because it was more attainable by users, etc. And I think that thinking still resonates with me today, as I'm a huge advocate of universal design principles.
Right.
I think you can learn so much from that. It kind of creates this more sort of pragmatic, sort of objective feel into the design, which can sometimes be somehow subjective.
Yeah.
Which is something that I always try to sort of stay away from. I really like the objective nature of design. And I think this idea of solid cognitive principles helps us as a practice in a great way.
I mean, when I talked to Rob, we talked a lot about kind of the ideas behind material design, and I think that's very connected to what you're talking about, and a very clear example of kind of that research work coming into a place where you're working now.
Absolutely. I mean, I really think there's a huge, I think, opportunity, and maybe again we go back to academia being such in a closed sort of boundary, being an echo chamber, is I think most designers would benefit immensely from just being more exposed to cognitive science, right?
Okay.
Cognitive science and psychology, because that really determines how users, our audience thinks, what they need, what they desire, what resonates better or not for them. So if you have solid knowledge in many of the studies that they keep putting out in those domains, in the domain of cognitive science, you can be a much better professional.
Right.
And your success is probably going to be a result of that.
That leads perfectly into what my next question was going to be. This is a question that I ask everybody, and you kind of started to answer it, is I'm very interested in the kind of contemporary design discourse and kind of what designers are talking about, writing about, kind of the publishing around design. And I'm interested in what you think is kind of missing from that. And the reason that I'm very curious kind of to hear what you say is because you had mentioned earlier about not wanting to kind of do a very explicitly design books and kind of talking about audience, and then the cognitive science. Kind of what do you see as missing right now?
That's a great. I mean, and again, this plurality. Something that I forgot to mention. Even if you look at the reviews from my latest book, which you can expand for others, you have magazines like Nature, Science, Wired, and then art and design magazines, and the range of reviews. And normally we got a book, and you get a review from a nugget. Now you have technology, design, art, biology, science, all. Because and that's I think the plurality of the book itself.
And each of those are probably bringing, different things are important in your books to each of those. So they're probably very different reviews too.
Absolutely, very different reviews. But exactly. To your point. So on my book of trees, for example, the second one, you would have people from information science commenting on the book on the value of course, tree diagrams over the edges. Then you had artists talking about the statics of those tree diagrams.
Right.
So yeah, you have people coming in and providing different angles and viewpoints. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things of my work, is being exposed to that plurality. So I always, again, like getting outside of the bubble of being a designer, only talking to designers and only reading design books,
Right.
which I've always tried, again, to get away from that bubble. But I always find captivating the work of designers that, again, try to cross-link different disciplines, either by talking about design in terms of economics, in terms of the environmental impact, and trying to dive into different disciplines.
Yeah.
I love all of those approaches. For me, I think that as a designer, you always ended up creating or talking about a product, right? Some sort of an experience that is meant to be used by an audience, right? By humans, normally. So there's no better practice than cognitive science for this, because it's a discipline, again, it's a domain that really explains how we humans, how our users, our audiences think.
Right.
What's appealing to them, what they sort of like, what's not as appealing to them. How, the different cognitive processes that underline our behaviors, right? I think, so if you get to know a little bit more of that, it's almost getting inside the mind of users, right? It's getting to, putting yourself in your user's shoes and building empathy. And as a designer, that's the ultimate goal, is to build empathy with your user base.
Right.
Because then you can really properly design whatever you're designing.
Right. Yeah.
Because if you get to know your audience in such a way, then you're probably doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So cognitive science, psychology, and research in those domains, unfortunately, is not as open today to many design practices, to many design, even schools don't have access to that. Right? So I think it's a huge sort of problem at the moment, and I think we should change that.
Yeah.
For example, some of the research that I've uncovered for my book of circles, and trying to explain why humans prefer circles, why are we so in love with circles, right? It all comes from that domain. It all predominantly comes from studies made in the domains of cognitive science.
Yeah.
So there's so much we can learn from that, and then that can help us gear our design practice in a much better way.
Yeah, I also love kind of what you were saying. I agree with all of that, but I really love what you were saying about this idea of kind of cross-linking or kind of jumping between disciplines. I feel like that's kind of so much of what the kind of writing that I'm trying to do, the kind of writing that I like to read, and kind of what I'm trying to kind of promote in a lot of these interviews is that design, when connected to all these other things, is where it really gets interesting. And cognitive science, I think, is you're right, is one that has not come up in any of these conversations that I've had, but is a very big blind spot.
It's a huge blind spot. So, for example, on the topic of like learning from cognitive science, when I was researching for the Book of Circles, I uncovered a study done, I think, 10 years ago, where they compared a set of objects and typefaces. So you might actually find this interesting. Objects and typefaces. And they were always in pairs. And one element of the pair was normally a rounded version of the object. Yeah. So you can think about a rounded watch.
Right.
And the other one was an angular, sort of like art edge, sort of version of that object or watch. They did the same for sofas, for a variety of different objects and typefaces. So you have like aerial and aerial rounded, right?
Right.
And users were asked to choose between version A or B.
Oh, interesting.
Right? And hands down, by far, the preferred version was always the rounded version.
Huh.
And this could, again, like most designers, for example, hate Comic Sans. They disliked it to a great degree. And as a designer myself, I have no special preference for Comic Sans. But it's understanding what's underlying that preference that could help us as designers. Right? Understanding that we have a strong preference for rounded shapes, right? For curves, generally speaking. That
so
could help, again, dictate how we actually do anything, from a chair to a digital experience to a typeface.
That's so. I mean, I don't want to. We're getting short on time. I don't want to get too off on that, but that's something that I think about all the time, because you're as designers, and I'm getting ready to start teaching a typography class, and so I've been thinking about this a lot. Is that one of the first things so many design students hear is that Comic Sans is bad, but it's like, why?
Yeah.
It's on every computer, and so many people use it as just their default typeface. So there must be something to that.
There is.
And it's like you're saying, connect that to another discipline and things start to kind of answer a little bit.
And then, I don't want to spend too much time here. This is like the whole research behind the Book of Circles.
Right.
But then you can actually uncover even why do we like curves, right? And so when you look at, for example, Comic Sans or rounded sort of typeface, there's an area of the brain that becomes activated, and that area of the brain is the same that activates elements of empathy.
Yeah,
right?
that's
so
interesting.
it evokes safety. So rounded shape, and it's not hard to imagine because in nature, think about the opposite, right? Angular shapes. Think about the teeth of an animal, or like the rock, or a thorn of a plant. Those are objects and shapes that normally invoke danger, right? Sometimes could actually lead you to death.
Right.
So roundedness and curves, they normally evoke safety, and people are reassured by those shapes more than they are by a really hard edge type of.
I love that shape. I mean, especially with my interest in design criticism and kind of how we're talking about designed objects, and so much of design writing is kind of, is this good or is it bad, without any consideration of how it's hitting, how it's reaching the user, how it's actually existing in the world, where does it come from, and I think that's kind of exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely, and I just want to, like, on the topic of, like, that you were bringing up about connecting different disciplines, this is something that I've been sort of advocating for so long, and even on my book of trees, I mentioned this as an opposition to a traditional way of looking at human knowledge, which is a tree, right?
Yeah.
You have the branch of philosophy that has its sub-branches, then you have the branch of medicine and its sub-branches, a branch of design, and then these branches never touch each other, right? They are always separate, right? But building, sort of like educating someone in just one single branch is so limiting, right?
Right.
And I think for me, at least, there's so many benefits of almost going back to this medieval polymath mentality of like, just explore as many domains as possible. Be inspired by those domains, because especially as a designer, I find you can get way more inspiration by, I don't know, reading a magazine on biology than just like reading another design book, right?
I mean, this was exactly what my last question was. I was curious, kind of, what are the books? Are there books or writers or people that you would recommend? Mostly designers, but recommend kind of people operating in this space that are kind of must read or kind of must know about people.
Oh, that's hard. I mean, most of the ones that I enjoyed have been sort of the classics. There's the book The Pattern Language. That's been a really sort of important book in my life. On the topic of networks, there's of course the book Linked. By Laszlo Marvasi. He's a great figure in the domain of network. I mean, of network science, really. So he did this book, I think, back in 2003, called Linked.
Okay.
And this is a book that I read, and then it kind of changed my perspective on the interest for networks in the first place, and then visualization as a sub interest. And then many books by Stephen Johnson. Popularizes science in really interesting ways. Emergence, to name a few. There's also, of course, I always say if I have to run from my house because there's a fire and I have to get.
This is a good way to think about
it. It's a good way, right? Yeah. Also because it actually happened once already in my life. Yeah, and I had a fire in an apartment in New York, and I literally had to make that decision in a split second.
This took a dark turn all of a sudden.
I know. It was actually all good. I mean, I was safe. Fortunately, nothing happened, but I lost a great amount of books and clothing and all that stuff. But anyway, you learn from those issues.
Wow. Okay.
But if there was one book on design that I would save, is this book. It's actually done by a collective of authors called Universal Design Principles.
Oh yeah, I know this one.
And again, the reason why I love that book so much is that the book in itself is a principle. The way it's organized and structured. Yeah. It's organized alphabetically, so it's like 100 principles. Right. Now they actually have an additional 25 principles. So it's organized alphabetically. Yeah. Every principle has 2 pages, right, as a spread. On one side, you have a description, you have a tagline, you have also an implicit network on the book. It's just, if you like this principle, you might also like something else. So you can navigate the book in that way, right, as a network. Right. And then you have really important visual examples on the right side of each principle. So I think that book, again, and also because the book leverages a lot of knowledge from economics, from biology, from a lot of what we think are design principles actually stem from other disciplines.
Yeah.
And so again, it really is a book that explores this pluralistic view that we've been sort of talking.
Thank you so much for talking. This was so great. I really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much for your time and
thank you
for talking.
Thanks for having me. That's great.
This episode was recorded on August 14th, 2017 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.